So I've covered the legal battle between Sony and Tencent for a while now in regards to Tencent's Horizon clone Light of Motiram, and that legal battle has finally come to a close. But for those who are not aware of Light of Motiram, this is what it looks like. And, at a glance, you'd be hard-pressed to know which is Horizon and which is Light of Motiram. And that's where the core of Sony's argument lies, that when you look at Light of Motiram, it's very easy to confuse it with Horizon. It's not about the fact that they're tackling a similar genre to Horizon, but the fact that the visual language of Light of Motiram is near identical to Horizon's, and this is something that even the general public agree with folks calling Light of Motiram Horizon Zero Originality or Horizon Forbidden Creativity, and this is something that garnered a lot of traction. I mean, even things like the marketing material, the trailer, you can hear for yourself and see for yourself that it could very well be confused for Horizon. Yeah, this is not Horizon, this is Light of Motiram. But you'd be hard-pressed to tell, right? And so in July of 2025, Sony full-on sued Tencent for essentially ripping off the Horizon video games. Now, the one-week argument in Sony's lawsuit was that they're basically copying the gameplay as well, which is not the case. Light of Motiram plays very differently from Horizon, but its overall aesthetic is pretty much a copy of Horizon, and that's the argument that they did eventually kind of lean more into. And the fact that it didn't take long for Tencent and the Light of Motiram devs to scrub their store page, change the game's description, images, and key art to something that is less reminiscent of Horizon goes to highlight that, like they did on some level, acknowledge some culpability. But Tencent tried to argue that Sony is essentially trying to have ownership over an entire genre, claiming that the genre that Light of Motiram is tackling and its themes and its visual aesthetic isn't far off from stuff that other games like Zelda and Far Cry and Outer Wilds and more have done, highlighting games like Enslaved: Odyssey of the West. But when you look at that game and its key art, you wouldn't be able to confuse it for Horizon. It's a similar post-apocalyptic setting where robots infest the land and whatnot, but the visual language is very different. Of course, Sony was having none of it, and they counter-argued, saying that Tencent's defense is nonsense. Tencent even tried to claim that, well, technically, Light of Motiram is not a Tencent game because this other shell corporation is helming this particular project, even though Tencent is the parent, so that argument was not something that Sony was particularly happy with. And yeah, Sony insisted that Tencent's claims are desperate and doesn't ultimately change the fact that Light of Motiram can very easily be confused for Horizon when you look at its overall aesthetic. I mean, stuff like this. Literally just right now, I glanced and I thought it was Horizon, and then I looked at the top left there. It even came to light that at one point, Sony and Tencent had discussions about Tencent potentially making a Horizon game. Sony rejected that proposal. And so the way Tencent is being perceived is they basically went, fine, if you won't let us make a Horizon game, we'll just make legally distinct Horizon. But that has not worked out for Tencent. Which finally brings us to December 18th, 2025. After months of legal battle and back and forths, we finally have a conclusion to this whole situation, and that is that Sony and Tencent have decided to settle, which means that they've reached some kind of confidential agreement, and Sony seemingly was happy enough with whatever the settlement agreement was that they decided to drop the case and not go full-on legal battle mode. Settlements are often the best end result for these kinds of legal battles. It's the path of least resistance, because once you do start getting into full-on court cases, that's when this stuff gets drawn out forever, and legal costs, can be pretty extensive. And, it's just more of a pain in the ass to go through that whole process versus just talking it out and doing a settlement like this. Now, from where I'm sitting, it seemed as though Sony ultimately came out victorious, that Sony had a stronger legal case, judging by the fact that the end result of this settlement was that Tencent's game got delisted. That's right. Light of Motiram is currently no longer available on any of the major storefronts. If you go to SteamDB right now, for example, you'll find this notification that reads, "This app has been retired and is no longer available on the Steam store." And if you try to go to its Steam page, if you try to say Google Light of Motiram on Steam and click on the link, you'll find that it doesn't take you to a store listing, it just takes you to Steam's homepage, which spotlights that Light of Motiram has been essentially nuked from storefronts. Even on Epic Games Store, you'll find that if you go to the link that is supposed to take you to the Epic Game Store's listing of Light of Motiram, you'll now just get a 404 error that says page not found. As for the exact details surrounding this legal battle, the Game Post reports that Sony and Tencent end the Light of Motiram lawsuit. They jointly asked the court to dismiss the case under a rule that allows both sides to end a lawsuit by agreement. This decision follows a confidential settlement between all parties involved. What the exact details are surrounding that settlement, we can only speculate because it is being kept confidential. But when it results in a game being nuked across the board from all storefronts, that usually means, the victor is pretty clear, and that ultimately Tencent had to capitulate because they knew that they were fighting a losing battle. It continues right here that the lawsuit has been dismissed with prejudice. That means the case is closed for good, and the same claims cannot be brought back to court later. The filing also confirms that all pending motions have been withdrawn and that each side will cover its own legal costs. And then in a statement to news outlet The Verge, a representative of Tencent America, Sean Durkin, had the following statement to give. SIE, Sony Interactive Entertainment, and Tencent are pleased to have reached a confidential resolution and will have no further public comment on this matter. SIE and Tencent look forward to working together in the future. So all's well that ends well, I suppose. And, Tencent clearly agreed to Sony's very strict stipulation of you got to take that game down or we are going to take you to court. And this legal battle will continue and you are fighting a losing battle. That's the general sense that I get. I think at one point Tencent realized that the legal threats that Sony was making were legitimate and had a lot of ground to be able to move forward. And Tencent decided that, they're going to quit while they're ahead and just erase this game. Though that's not to say that Light of Motiram will be gone forever. It may very well be that they're just going to overhaul the visual language and aesthetics of the game and re-release it down the line. We don't know if the project in its entirety has been canceled. There's been no official announcement that Light of Motiram has been canceled and that it will no longer release. It might just take another form in the future after the aesthetic and visual and cosmetic overhaul has been fully implemented, so that there's no question that Light of Motiram is a different property from Horizon instead of something that straight up copies a lot of its visual language. I suppose only time will tell, but all I'll say is that, to me it feels like Tencent had it coming. It was just such a blatant copying job. And given the history of Tencent and Sony and how Tencent wanted to make a Horizon game but were told no, that only makes the optics worse, where it feels like this was Tencent's way of being well, F you, we were still going to make a Horizon game. We're just not going to call it Horizon. We're just changing the name of something, but, ultimately retaining and copying the visual language. But that's not going to be enough to get you out of trouble. You have to change the very identity of your game to not resemble the thing that you're taking inspiration from. The thing is, with Light of Motiram, it was very clear that they were leveraging Horizon to market their game. To be hey, we're making a legally distinct Horizon. That was a big part of what drew a lot of attention to this game, and they knew that would be the end result. And this is not a case of this being a parody of Horizon. It's just them making their own version of Horizon, but in a way where the resemblance was far too uncanny. But yeah, this is the end result, and I suppose only time will tell how all of this will pan out in the future, whether we'll see Light of Motiram return in a very different form, or whether ultimately we'll see this project get canceled if they cannot, make it original enough in its aesthetic and visual language and style and art direction. But until then, I'd love to hear what your thoughts and opinions are on this deliberation and this conclusion and resolution to this court case in the comments below. What do you think happened behind the scenes? What do you think the confidential deal was? And what do you think about the fact that Tencent ultimately delisted Light of Motiram from, Steam and Epic and all the storefronts? And what you think the future holds for Light of Motiram? Do you think it'll come back, or do you think it's dead in the water? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.